talk about the many faces of church organization. Steve is local here. He's been with the University Church going on his 24th year. He and his wife Pam and both of their daughters are alumni of Florida College, and we're happy to have him here with us this morning. I've only known Steve for a short time, but it doesn't take long to appreciate the work that he does and the kind of man that he is. So, Steve Patton.
I asked Will to keep it short because I got too much material. I do appreciate the kind words. There's always a risk in having someone introduce you who you preach to on Sundays. So I really do appreciate the kind words. I really do. Two things I want to say in the beginning. First, this is a lecture on church history. And I know only about 3 of you just went, yes. For the rest of you that may not find history all that interesting, I just want to say that there are great lessons for us today contained in such a study. And Brother Harold was trying to point that out to us last night, and I really appreciate the things he had to say. But I want to examine this morning some lessons from church history. The second thing I want to say in introduction is I am not a historian. I'm just a preacher of the gospel who finds value in studying church history and trying to get the lessons that we can from it. Some of you are real historians, and I'd appreciate your guiding me to a fuller understanding of any of the topics that I'm discussing this morning. And my lecture doesn't follow the book exactly, but closely. I hope you'll read it. It's more extensive on some of the topics I discussed this morning. This is a wide-ranging topic encompassing 2,000 years of church history, and it's impossible to cover all the related topics from 2 millennia. But I plan to touch on the main streams of thought and practice from which I really feel we can learn so many lessons, and we'll try to draw them today. There's no way to overemphasize the importance of this topic. It's recognized as one of the major influences in the entire history of the church. Philip Johnson actually begins his best-selling A History of Christianity with the Jerusalem meeting in Acts 15. He sees it as the beginning of the organization that becomes the Catholic Church. Now, I must state in the beginning that I believe in the finality of apostolic authority. Adherence to the Bible pattern is why I consider this subject so important. The form of church organization is not an option if there is a pattern revealed in Scripture. So we will recount the development of the main forms of church organization, of which there are 3, Episcopal, Presbyterian, and Congregational. And though there are variations on these, including what the offices are at each level of organization, most churches can be put into one of these 3 categories, and refuting the general forms of error pretty much refutes them all. When each of these organizational forms arose is significant, but I believe the more important question to study historically is why they arose. We need to examine each in its historical setting and see abuses arise from circumstances influencing the thinking of that particular time. Christianity is not practiced in a vacuum. Most departures are not just the result of misunderstanding a passage of Scripture. That's the value of studying church history, and I really commend the faculty for having this series. There's a general recognition among historians that the early church was congregational, independent local congregations. However, many see it as a weakness to be overcome, or as just a beginning point that will be effectively changed over time. They don't see it as a reason for the early success of the church. Philip Schaff writes at length about the congregational nature of the first century church and the role of a local eldership. But he'll have little problem with its change by the mid-2nd century. However, he points out concerning bishops and presbyters, they appear always as a plurality or as a college in one and the same congregations, even in smaller cities like Philippi. Even a historian as liberal as Philip Johnson recognized this. Writing about the chances of survival of what he called the Pauline gospel, he points out, it stood a good chance of surviving and spreading, but it had no organization behind it. Paul did not believe in such a thing. He believed in the Spirit working through him and others. The principle of the final authority of Scripture leads us to glean from Scripture all it has to say on the matter. And I've never thought this difficult. Apparently, neither do many historians who recognize the basic biblical pattern. The New Testament pattern is consistent, and we see it develop as the Lord's kingdom is established throughout the world. And these are its essentials. Elders were appointed in every local church. There was always a plurality of men. The 6 terms for this office, elder, bishop, presbyter, pastor, shepherd, overseer, are translations of 3 Greek words that are used interchangeably. All are used in some form in Acts 20 to refer to the elders at Ephesus. They are told to feed the flock as shepherds do. These are not different offices in the New Testament. James was not the head elder or the bishop in Jerusalem, and is not so designated in Acts 15 as some assume. Elders' rule was local, 1 Peter 5 and verse 2, as is also indicated by the fact that every specific designation of a group of elders in the New Testament is within a specific church, not a group of churches. There is also, of course, the appointment of deacons in every church, the diakonos, the servants of the church. The earliest documented change in organizational structure is the rise of the presiding bishop in a local congregation. And the earliest reference to the office of bishop separate from elders appears in the writings of Ignatius of Antioch in the early 2nd century. He implied the office was one above the rest of the elders in a local church. Now, Ignatius served in such an office. In one of his letters to the Magnesians, he urged them to be obedient to their bishop. And of course, that indicates he was not the only presiding bishop in the church at his time. However, the view of the presiding bishop wasn't yet universal during his time. Ignatius himself wrote of Christians who acted independently of the monarchical bishop. Polycarp, who was a contemporary of Ignatius, did not speak of a bishop in addition to the presbyters. Of course, neither did the Apostle Paul. But by the end of the 2nd century, the separate office of a presiding bishop in a local church is generally accepted. The real impetus for an organization larger than the local congregation really arose from the need to fight false doctrine. Philip Johnson sees the splintered nature of the church by the 3rd century as a major problem. And Gnosticism and Marcionism and other false doctrines were widespread by the mid-2nd century. And there were great men in the church who arose to fight such heresies, and they were successful. But as a result, the early church began to see combating false doctrine and uniting the church in that fight as essential. John Kennedy, in his book, The Torch of the Testimony, discusses this change of emphasis and how it becomes a uniting force in binding the universal church together. When the church later began to fracture over Arianism, Constantine intervened to try to unite the factions within the church on doctrine. He also wanted to keep Christianity united for his own purposes, certainly. But he attempted to unite the church on the matter by calling together representatives from churches from all over the empire to consider and decide this doctrinal matter once and for all. And that's what the Council of Nicaea is about in 325 AD. And it rejected Arianism. And despite the good intent Constantine may have had in calling this council, Nicaea was a culmination of the inevitable movement towards centralization in the ecumenical church's authority. At last, one body of men has succeeded in speaking as the voice of the world church. And the consequent council at Constantinople in 381 was backed by Constantine for its declaration that the statement of Nicaea was the one lawful religion. Well, doctrinal power was now vested in the councils, and the power of the clerical order was now in place. This general shift from the emphasis upon the spiritual side of Christianity to the intellectual defense of truth contributes to the influence of the intellectuals upon the whole church. The power to decide between truth and error was being vested in these clerics. And a hierarchical church order was now growing, and they were demanding through the councils 100% agreement on the truth. And any who deviated the slightest would be marked as heretics and banished. No local church had the right to make its own decision on these matters. The correct doctrine came down from above, and I'm not talking from heaven. Let me make a couple of observations here. First, I've learned that most religious historians see the universal organizing of the church as its salvation and its most important early development. I see it as the instrument of destruction of simple New Testament Christianity and the effective means of spreading false doctrine. I see the early church spreading virally without universal organization and then being overrun by it. Modern scholars see a splintered church brought together through such universal organization. However, are we very different from the church of the 3rd and 4th century when we began to allow men or institutions to exercise greater influence over the Lord's church? We've seen it in the rise of institutionalism among us. But also, when we, in practice, give decision-making power to journals and to schools and to leading preachers and to writers, we're doing exactly what happened in the early church history when champions against false teachers were given great influence over churches in general. Then, when these men began to advance false doctrines through these councils, the whole church went with them. It helps me to understand, though not fully agree with, men like Daniel Summer, who in the early 20th century opposed all such church-related institutions where these men of influence were most often found. I remember hearing a preacher comment about a preacher who was well known during the institutional controversy and for whom I have great respect. But he said of this man, if it was not for him, the conservative cause may not have survived. Well, I disagree. And believing the salvation of the church is dependent upon certain great men is really a bad idea. Secondly, I see how one's definition of the church universal decides how you think it should organize and function. In defining the church, Schaff saw it as a visible organization. It embraces all who are baptized, whether in the Greek or Roman or Protestant communion. As a body in general, the church is an organic union of its many members. And as you continue to read, it's evident he sees the universal church composed of all churches and denominations. And this is, of course, the prevalent view among historians, church scholars, and commentators. Well, tying the churches together organizationally is a small step if you already believe the basic organization to the church universal is made up of local churches or denominations. The biblical concept gives absolutely no organization to the universal church. It's made up of individual Christians, all in a direct personal relationship with their Lord. There is no instruction to unite us all into one universal functioning unit, even if we think this will strengthen the Lord's work. The Post-Nicene Church from 325 to about 600 AD was a period when ecumenical councils drew up ecumenical creeds and the church hierarchy gained greater control. It's during the brief reign of Pope Boniface III that the Emperor Phocas declared, "The see of blessed Peter the Apostle should be the head of all the churches," referring to Rome. Well, the bishops of Rome had already been exercising such power for some time, but the universal Catholic Church by that time was at least nominally complete. Well, the tension between the church in the East and the Roman Church grew during this time, and a complete division is finalized in the 11th century, although it had existed in practice for a long time. And because of space limitations, I mainly discuss the Roman Church here and not the Eastern Church. But a universal church that has political interests now needed a universal defender to guard its territory. Pope Stephen II in the 8th century reached out to the Franks and conferred upon King Pepin the Short the responsibility of defending the church, really the Pope. The church now had military might to advance it. And the union really benefited both of them. The Pope had an army now to defend and advance his cause, and Pepin had the power of the church to support his political ambitions. Pepin's son, Charlemagne, was crowned by the Pope in St. Peter's Basilica, declaring him Emperor of the Romans. Now we have the foundation for the great empire that carried the designations Holy and Roman. Now the faith could be spread by military might without apology. Charlemagne imposed Roman Christianity upon conquered lands by force when necessary. He began to appoint church officials based on land holdings, and these patrons of the church possessed the power to appoint bishops and abbots in their own regions. Church and state were united universally as the dominant force in Europe. Patton observes the church was virtually a department of state. The rise of the College of Cardinals in the 11th century further consolidated papal power in one place in Rome. It moved power from local metropolitan bishops to cardinals in Rome over specific regions. Let's make some more observations from that. Universal organization invariably leads to seeking means to maintain power in such. The papacy, though a religious organization, was not inoculated against lust for power and greed and corruption. But even today, once influence is gained in the Lord's church, it's not always readily given up. Men come to see the wide influence gained from positions in institutions like colleges and papers. And when such wide influence is enjoyed, often an attitude of self-importance can develop and lead to exercising influence and control through these institutions. Let me give you an example. This is clearly illustrated in the 1950s when Gospel Advocate editor B.C. Goodpasture printed a letter from a reader suggesting preachers opposing institutional ideas were sowing seeds of discord and they should be quarantined. Goodpasture's approval was implicit in publishing the letter and in the direction the Advocate takes in its following issues. In fact, the paper's position caused many preachers to recant in order to stay in the fold of the Gospel Advocate circle of influence. Well, universal power of the church also meant power over centers of learning in history. The most influential medieval schools were started by monks and gave degrees in canon law and theology, with theology considered the queen of the sciences. Thus, the church's tentacles reached into every part of societal control. We think of Christians in their daily life influencing institutions. They thought of the church, that is, its hierarchy and its institutions, changing society through its immense power and influence. We need to guard against the mindset that thinks our institutions are necessary for the success of the church in the world. They are not. Papal supremacy and power reached its zenith under Pope Innocent in the 13th century. He brought several European rulers to their knees for violation of canon law. However, this period of strong church rule also saw the church begin to fracture, much of it due to such ironclad demands of doctrinal purity and allegiance to the Pope. Indeed, the first church inquisitions, probably their greatest abuse of power, grew out of these periods as the church fought to quell such spiritual rebellions like the Waldensians and the Albigenses. But this absolute power of the church in many ways became its own worst enemy as people began to rebel against its domineering rule and its widespread corruption. Many here began to declare their desire to return to the simpler times of the first century church. Now, Rome could not tolerate such ideas, and the Inquisitions were designed to eliminate such heresies. Thus, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in the 13th century began the practice of executing heretics. The Roman Church began to lose control partly because it sought overwhelming power and control. Now, all these centuries of political and religious intrigue and doctrinal and military conflicts on a large scale certainly stands in contrast to a humble servant of the Lord personally taking his Bible and seeking to serve God according to what he reads and understands. Such a concept was foreign to the medieval church, and it continues in the Catholic tradition today. Universal organization means universal control, but personal responsibility means a personal relationship with God, working with a small group of fellow believers, just trying to follow biblical teaching in one's daily life. One practice draws you closer to the church. The other brings you closer to God. A schism takes place in the 14th century, resulting in 2 popes and 2 colleges of cardinals. And the solution to this schism plays a major role in shifting of power within the church for a time. It led to the revival of the principle of conciliarism, that is, the use of councils. Conciliarism had been practiced centuries earlier in Constantine's church when he established great councils like the Council of Nicaea with the power to decide matters. This time, such a council assumed authority for itself, but proclaimed its right to decide for the church in these matters. It deposed the 2 competing popes, and it appointed a third. Well, this schism was eventually mended, but the idea of the universal authority of a representative council was revived. Claims for papal authority would not diminish in Rome, of course. Papal infallibility becomes a church doctrine 400 years later, but the reappearance of conciliation councils is going to play a role in future Catholic Church organization and in the Presbyterian form of government that will arise. Well, the blatant political and financial motives of the church led to controversial new ideas emphasizing one's individual and personal relationship with God. And men like William of Ockham and John Wycliffe and John Huss introduced ideas that mitigated against centralized papal power. Wycliffe's work was greatly aided by his desire to put the Bible back into the hands of the common man. John Huss in Europe would continue Wycliffe's idea that God's chosen could be determined just by their manner of life. That kind of idea undercut the entire hierarchical structure of the church, who had kept for itself the right to determine who was saved and who was lost. And this kind of individualism would lay the foundation for the Great Reformation. Now, there are lessons to learn here, too. First, the Scriptures have always emphasized the individual and personal relationship each disciple has with his Lord. When such a relationship is separated by a church with a clergy that insists it stands between you and God, church authority undermines one of the most important principles of Christianity, a personal relationship with God. But second, the biblical principle of church independence and autonomy can certainly bring Christians much closer to such a relationship. But we can make the same mistake if we identify our faithfulness by being associated with a faithful church. Medieval church members sought a relationship with God through church membership and obedience to its officers, who alone administered the soul-saving sacraments. They thought that's what would make them right with God. Well, we cannot make the same mistake of practicing churchianity, believing we are faithful if we hold membership in the right church and participate in the Sunday worship. Third, creeds are usually the result of super church organization. In order to maintain control over many churches, a standard of belief must be formulated and made the standard for all churches. It's telling that men who opposed Roman authority during these times nonetheless copied its practice by codifying all belief and then demanding followers to adhere to the new creed. This, to a great extent, is what Calvin did. And although he broke with Catholicism and its authority, he codified his beliefs, demanded strict adherence to them of all who entered his jurisdiction and beyond. And he could do this partly because he exercised authority beyond his moral influence and through the extended influence he had through the developing Presbyterian form of government, a form that reaches beyond the local congregation. As history so often illustrates, the effort to bring all churches into strict conformity on doctrine, which in a general sense is not a bad desire, usually results in supercongregational development. Kennedy, again in The Torch of the Testimony, refers to this as the intellectualization of the faith. It occurs when a group becomes obsessed with getting the doctrine right across all churches and fails to develop the inner man, to emphasize grace and love as well as morality and obedience. There is, after all, more to being a faithful servant to God than just getting the doctrine right. I'm often asked, can you recommend a sound church where we'll be traveling? And I know what they mean. Can you recommend a church that's straight on 2 or 3 specific doctrines they have in mind? The truth is, that church may be straight on those doctrines and be an absolute mess otherwise. If so, are they sound? Well, not by a long shot. But they answer for their condition and not me or any other person or congregation. By the time Martin Luther in the 1500s, the Catholic Church was facing many problems. The increased power of state governments began to weaken the church's economic and political control over Europe. And the church was placing greater and greater financial demands upon the faithful. The selling of powerful church offices throughout Europe to raise funds was widely practiced, and the neglect of the local parishes by Rome left them without guidance and teaching. Also, the state rulers were looking for an excuse to throw off papal power and control, and Luther gave it to them. Luther's reform begins in Saxony, but he soon saw a need for more than local organization to give it life. And Luther even agreed temporarily to let the government serve to maintain the true faith by appointing priests, deposing unworthy priests, and overseeing many church matters. Unfortunately, this system of state government became institutionalized, and his church became dependent upon the state for funds. Luther's co-reformer, Ulrich Zwingli, called for a stricter adherence to Scripture than Luther. Luther saw Scriptures as the story of salvation. Church polity and liturgy were non-essential parts that were open to variety. Zwingli, however, believed that one should not practice what the Bible did not specifically enjoin, and that included church organization. Zwingli preached returning to the Scriptures alone, even for a pattern in church organization, though he practiced it inconsistently. But in these seminal Reformation efforts, we see this desire to return to the Bible as the final authority and a consequent breaking down of the universal rule of the papacy. Reformers saw papal rule as an addition to biblical authority and therefore unacceptable. And so we see the rise of simpler forms of church organization based on an appeal to apostolic authority and its patterns. It's in the Anabaptist movement that arose out of Zwingli's followers that we find the impetus to separate church and state. They saw no reason for the state to be involved in church matters. And that was a revolutionary idea and would have a profound effect in many areas of the Reformation, including church organization. Now again, giving the Word its rightful authority leads back to the biblical pattern of church organization. And though it will be implemented imperfectly in many denominations as it was nonetheless a goal. We have to give them credit. They did want to return to the Scriptures for authority and reject the papacy's concept of an earthly authority over the church. And we are indebted to them for that. But since most followed Luther's concept of biblical authority rather than Zwingli's, we see the varying forms of church organization throughout denominationalism. But really, almost all would have claimed there in their earlier years that authority rests finally in the Scriptures and not in earthly headquarters. So whether we want to admit it or not, we owe these men a debt, a great debt. I found I have a great debt to one of my own ancestors. So let me relate this personal example. Last fall, Pam and I had an amazing experience. One of my brothers had researched our ancestry back into Scotland and established a direct tie with Matthew Patton, or Patton. He lived from 1600 to 1666 and was my grandfather, 7 generations removed. I wear the Patton tartan today in my tie. But he was a simple cobbler in the village of New Milnes, about 25 miles south of Glasgow. His life ended abruptly in 1666 when he and a few other men were taken to Glasgow Square, given a chance to recant their Reformation beliefs, and when they refused, were beheaded. Last September, while in Glasgow, Pam and I sought a plaque I had learned about that honored these men. In Glasgow's Mitchell Library Historical Section, 3 ladies helped research this for us, and after about 45 minutes, they found the plaque's location. They said, it's in Glasgow Cathedral, the oldest and most prominent cathedral in all of Scotland. We immediately went to the cathedral and told one of the patrons what we sought. And he directed us to a place to the left of the cathedral's elevated pulpit, and there, down a few steps and to the right, hung a large plaque, including the name of Matthew Patton, who, it says, suffered at the cross of Glasgow for their testimony to the covenants and the work of Reformation, because they durst not to own the authority of the then tyrants, destroying the same. He then took us outside the wall and showed us their graves. This simple cobbler, who refused to recant his religious beliefs, paid the ultimate price. And I owe something to him and to others like him. No, he didn't have all the doctrine right, but he was on the road, a road in which we are much farther along. But they were leading the way in rejecting Catholic and Anglican authority and pleading for a return to the Scriptures as our guide, and we are indebted to them. The Church of England's break with Rome occurred in the 16th century, and doctrine was not the real reason for that break, and it essentially mimicked the organization and control of the Catholic Church, although separate from it. But in almost all of the new denominations, a larger organization than the local church was implemented primarily for the purpose of propagating their movement and to support one another. The ties became stronger when they took on church-wide works, especially evangelism. In fact, the consequent worldwide Protestant evangelistic efforts of the 18th and 19th century are considered by many as unparalleled in history. But the denominations tend toward tying all their churches together for the larger good. They may give lip service to congregational autonomy, but they still yield significant power to the appointed officers and committees at the national level. I believe all these people had a problem viewing the church without an institutional view of the body. It was deeply rooted in their heritage and seen as necessary to maintain the purity of the faith and to spread the gospel. They saw the Church Universal as a collection of local churches who, though nominally independent, would answer to the larger body for any deviations and transgressions from the accepted norm. Such norms would inevitably be expressed in creeds. And when discipline was felt necessary, it was often by removing entire congregations from the fellowship. Well, such an action would be the natural result of institutional thinking and control. Churches would regard the removal of a congregation from the fellowship also as tantamount to leaving the faith for all members of that local congregation. The congregation answered not only to God, but to the institutional body of the denomination, whose will was expressed in their creed and enforced by its national officers, synods, and conventions. As we will see, such institutional thinking also affected churches of Christ in the 19th and 20th century. I want to mention one other significant development during this time that will greatly influence Reformation church organization. During the Church Counter-Reformation, initiated by the Council of Trent in 1546, attempts were made to right many evils in the Catholic Church. What followed was a great wave of Catholic missionary zeal which spread into the Americas. And during this time, a pattern developed for this work. Missionaries took on the evangelization of large regions by establishing a central mission from which all the work originated and through which all the monies flowed. This type of mission organization is totally without biblical precedent, but it's a convenient means for maintaining universal control of the church over a large area. It became the norm, and it's imitated both in Protestantism and even by many churches of Christ today. I've seen it in Ethiopia. When I first visited there in 2002, there was already a large contingent of churches of Christ. The result of efforts begun in the 1960s by brethren I regard as constitutional, and I appreciate that work. But these brethren established missions that mimic the Catholic concept almost exactly. A headquarters was established with a mission head, and under him there was set up a local church, a school, and a missions organization. All funds supporting the Ethiopian work are sent to, controlled by, and distributed from the mission. All decisions about who's qualified to preach and where he will go and how much he is paid, where church buildings will be built and schools established, all come from the mission head and its board. They possess final authority in all things. And obviously, such power gives them almost complete control over doctrine as well. Well, the churches were trained to be totally dependent upon the mission for everything. The system practically worked for many years until it became too large for a single mission to manage. And preachers also became frustrated in being under the thumb of headquarters. Problems arose. Frustration grew. And the number of churches in Ethiopia actually began to decline. Only when they began to return to the biblical pattern of local church and evangelist independence did real evangelistic fervor return. Today, the number of independent churches multiply by the dozens every year. Without central control and guidance, evangelistic work is now more effective than ever in Ethiopia. It is following the biblical pattern of churches supporting evangelists directly without any intervening organization or sponsoring church. John Calvin's Geneva is an interesting study among the reformers. His iron rule over the city produced a place where church, state, and community all worked under Christian principles. But his voice overruled all. Despite his repudiation of papal authority over church and state, he essentially created a microcosm of the same authority in his adopted hometown. It would be one of Calvin's disciples, John Knox, who would effectively implement the Presbyterian form of church government. Knox went to Scotland from Geneva, and he was radically Calvinist. But he successfully united religious factions, and Presbyterianism became Scotland's established religion. This form of church government is comprised of a series of representative assemblies, beginning with the local church presbyters, who unite to form an area presbytery. Then the presbyteries in a region form a synod or a council, which then unite in the General Assembly representing the entire church. Presbyterians contended that the local churches were essentially autonomous, but as usually happens in any growing organization, power began to flow to the top. It is this form of government that is found in different varieties in most denominations today. They claim many times to reject a centralized hierarchy, but they eventually establish one on a smaller scale. Acts 15 is always offered as a basis for councils. The Jerusalem gathering is seen as leaders in the church coming together for a meeting of the minds and then sending out letters regarding the decisions reached. However, if the early church actually believed in the finality of apostolic authority, why would they decide to simply agree to the decisions of a joint council on matters of doctrine? Apostolic authority was final in the early church, not council decisions. And the decisions reached in Acts 15 are based upon Old Testament prophecies and the words of the apostles who were present at that meeting. Well, it's the Puritan movement in England that strongly influenced the spread of local church autonomy. John Robinson was one of the earliest to clearly articulate church autonomy. And the Puritans rejected papal authority and state church rule. They were eventually joined in England by other groups, including the Independents, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Quakers, and the Unitarians. All claimed to reject centralized rule, though all eventually practiced a form of organization larger than the local church. But their appeal to the Scriptures to establish their basic congregational rule resulted in them being persecuted, especially by Catholic and Anglican churches. And of course, that's why many of them came to America. In North America, a religious revival was taking place. The Great Awakening of the early 1800s was a widespread spiritual revival that caused many on the frontier to have a religious experience and to join a church. Actually, more denominations were formed as the older groups would not tolerate the unrestrained emotionalism and the rejection by a few of them of some Calvinistic tenets. These new groups usually had less restrictive ties between congregations, but they also saw the need to have a national structure to aid the spread of their movement and to support one another. And as inevitably happens, doctrinal control would eventually become important, and creeds would be written to control their churches. It was a stronger demand for doctrinal oneness and unbending adherence to the creed that really eventually led to bitter strife among the denominations. Some began to break away over this intense religious division that ensued and would seek union by pleading for the rejection of these human creeds and following the Bible alone. Though such a plea can be traced certainly back to England and Scotland long before this time, it took root in America in what we know as the Restoration Movement. And leaders in the movement arose pleading for the end of religious division and a universal response to Jesus' plea that we all be one. Though preceded by others, the principle of restoring New Testament Christianity was spread most effectively in America by the Stone Campbell movement. Both men made strong appeals to apostolic authority and believed in the independence of the local church. Campbell clearly believed the local congregation is independently organized with elders and deacons. It was the foundation, one of the foundation stones of the movement, and he trumpeted church autonomy often in his writings. However, it later became clear he was not opposed to cooperation of churches, especially in evangelism. In his paper, The Christian Baptist, he argued just as a local church can do what a single Christian cannot do, a group of churches should work together to accomplish what one church alone cannot do. He was opposed, and little more was said by him for a decade, but by 1841, as Earl West observes, Campbell was thoroughly convinced that the brethren were not taking full advantage of the opportunities, and therefore better organization was needed. Campbell's thinking agreed with others who continued to defend church associations as helpful in doing many things. And among them was to bring the small means of individual congregations together and to accomplish with these united means what no one congregation could effect. This rationale led Campbell to establish the American Christian Missionary Society, an action that played a major role in splitting the Restoration Movement churches into two main groups, one favoring church-wide cooperation and institutions, and the other opposed to such forms of cooperation and their resulting institutions. And though Campbell and others of his time fought fiercely for congregational independence, it appears they still had a view of a universal church comprised of congregations, not individuals. And though they strenuously objected to hierarchical structure and authority, they believed churches could unite voluntarily to accomplish larger works, forming organizations that had their own officers and other administrations. Well, such thinking admits the proposition that the organization revealed in the New Testament is insufficient to carry out the Great Commission. It implies if Paul had just been wise enough to set up an evangelistic society to direct world missions, the first century church could have accomplished so much more. But the result was a division in the movement between those who favored the society and those who were opposed. And though other issues were involved in the split, especially instrumental music, the issue of church organization was one of the sparks that began the division. Society supporters were charged with not following the simple organization found in the New Testament and abandoning apostolic authority. The society supporters said evangelism was a church-wide responsibility, and the New Testament had left open how it should be accomplished. Essentially, the same argument for church polity made by Luther centuries earlier. We saw similar thinking among churches of Christ in the mid-20th century. Post-World War II evangelistic fervor burned to send missionaries to the defeated nations of the conflict. And brethren again felt the need to create an organizational apparatus they believed was necessary to handle such a large evangelistic need. Opposed to establishing hierarchies, they sought another way to unite congregations in larger works. In his examination of the 20th century church through the annual Abilene Christian College lectures, William Banowski makes these observations about what transpired, and I quote, "The absence of an organized missionary society among churches of Christ created several unique handicaps in selection and preparation of qualified missionary workers. At the Abilene Christian Lectureship, a momentous biblical principle governing missionary methods was articulated and recommended as a remedy for this brotherhood predicament. The principle was described as inter-congregational cooperation without ecclesiastical organization. It greatly expanded the scope of the church's evangelistic opportunities and led logically to the recognition of the special role of the sponsoring congregation as compared with the part to be played by smaller participating churches." End quote. Banowski observes, the idea was voiced at the Abilene lectures as early as 1919 by George Klingman. However, on the same lectureship, F.B. Shepherd spoke out against any such effort that required organization beyond the local church, and M.C. Curfew spoke against it the following year. Banowski's assessment of those who wanted greater organization for such work was this. He said they cannot resist the temptation to shop about and contrast their plight with the obvious strong points in denominational machinery. Thus, they sought for some practical scriptural means of brotherhood-wide cooperation without creating an agency for brotherhood-wide control. One of the early examples of the sponsoring church arrangement was begun by the Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock, Texas, following World War II. G.C. Brewer, the local evangelist, declared they would sponsor the evangelization of Europe. And in 1947, the Union Avenue Church in Memphis announced they would sponsor mission work in Japan. Ed Harrell observes, by the end of 1946, the rush toward concentrating funds in the hands of large congregations to sponsor missions had become a stampede. The sponsoring church became one of the main divisive issues in the second half of the 20th century. Accompanied by pleas for financial support of church-related institutions like colleges and orphans' homes and medical missions, this section of the Restoration movement split from the more conservative wing and became the dominant group. You know, this thinking is reflected in a common phrase of the time my mother related to me. She remembered when she was young, if someone wanted to do a good work, it would be said, let the church do it, so the church can receive all the glory, based on Ephesians 3 and verse 20. You see, in the institutional idea of the church, individual action is actually secondary to church action. Well, there are more lessons to learn here. When issues arrive, we often begin to take sides, and not necessarily based on truth, but on what certain men or congregations believe on the issues. That is the same mistake we see in the 2nd and 3rd century church. And we also begin to think of the universal church dividing by congregations. But if the universal church cannot organizationally unite, how can it organizationally divide? Passages like 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 10 address division in a local church, not division existing between congregations. Now, I know this may not be readily seen, but look where the failure to see this principle leads. Such thinking has led on occasion to one congregation withdrawing from another. Well, if we believe local churches are not organizationally tied to one another, how is such possible? Also, it leads us to marking every member of an erring congregation as unfaithful. I suspect there may be members in those churches, particularly new converts, who have no idea about such issues, who are serving the Lord with their whole heart. And that can also lead us to removing another congregation's candlestick before the Lord does, or leaving it longer than He would. We must remember the final judgment of another congregation's faithfulness is in the Lord's hands. Further, it leads to building parties in the kingdom. These are our congregations. That's one of their congregations. Already we are thinking of the universal church in an institutional sense. Such parties of churches are often built around institutions, like religious journals and colleges. But this is true among non-institutional brethren too. I've known of too many cases where the faithfulness of a gospel preacher was determined by what religious journals to which he subscribed, or what college he attended, or what lectureships he attended, or with what preachers he might be friendly. Often no effort was made to talk to him to learn his personal beliefs. We need to be very careful that while we teach congregational independence, we are not thinking institutionally. Either a local congregation is wholly independent of other congregations, or it is not. Well, we don't have time to discuss many other things related to this topic, but know this. Church organization has played a major role in church history in almost every generation. And all of this goes back to the one underlying principle that sets the standard for all my beliefs, the standard of apostolic authority. I may apply it imperfectly, but I'm committed to it. Not just in church organization, but in all I believe in practice and service to my Lord. Without it, there is no standard at all. And I urge you, let's be faithful to the pattern of the New Testament. Not just in organization, but in all things. Thank you.